Well, good morning. It's time for us to begin. Glad you're all here and doing well. Even the lame and the crippled are here. Is your foot feeling better? Yeah, I would. After I quit laughing, I'd feel terrible. What would you say is the best known verse of Scripture in the entire Bible? Anybody? Yeah, John 3:16. For God so loved the world. The idea that God loves us is kind of amazing if you stop and think about it. But to the ancient peoples, that was an awesome concept because they looked at God as this all-powerful being sitting separate from heaven up in his throne room and looking down upon mankind. And to a Jew or to anybody, actually, the idea that your God would love you was kind of astounding and amazing, particularly those who worshipped Zeus and Apollo and the false gods. The idea that their God might love them was an alien concept. So when Jesus came along and Paul started teaching that God loves you, that was very amazing. The word love is probably the most abused, misused, misunderstood word in the English language. There are thousands of songs that speak of love. Over the years, I've had opportunity to counsel with couples who are going to get married or who are already been married. And I always ask, I turn to the girl and I say, "Do you love him?" And she always says, "Well, sure." And I turn to the guy and say, "Do you love her?" He says, "Well, yeah." Particularly if they're going to get married, they still love each other. And then I say, "Well, what does that mean?" And I get all kinds of weird looks when I say that. Well, and they try to define it, and they can't. Very few people can actually come up with a real definition for love. I say, "Well, if you say you love this woman, what does that mean?" We use the word love a lot. But what does it mean? Like I said, in English, we have a problem because we basically have one word that means 100 different things. You know, I say, well, I love my wife. I love my children. I love my friends. I love my dog. I love ice cream. And so we use the word in a whole pantheon of ways, a whole raft of ways, but what does it really mean to say you love something? In the Greek language, there are 4 different words for love, and that is a little better. One of the Greek words that's translated love is a romantic kind of love. One of the Greek words translated love is a friendship love. For example, the word Philadelphia is a Greek word translated into English, and it means the city of brotherly love. One of the Greek words translated love means a love for your family, more of a family type love. But the word that is used most often in Scripture, in the biblical love, and the one that is the important word we've all heard, is agape. The problem with that word is we don't use it that way very often. We don't use the word love in that sense. But yet it's the most important. The Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13, now, to understand this passage, we need to understand the context of the passage. In chapter 12, Paul was talking about spiritual gifts. he said, now the problem with the Corinthian church was they were a young church. They didn't have much background in the Old Testament. It was a Greek church. And so they didn't understand a lot of biblical concepts. And so when Paul planted the church there, they brought in people from a whole pagan background. They understood very little about Jehovah and about God and so forth. And so when the church got its start, they didn't have a lot of depth of understanding behind them. And so they had all kinds of problems. They were suing each other and all kinds of issues. And they had been given spiritual gifts. Some of them were able to speak in foreign languages that they had never studied. Some of them were able to heal, and some of them, they had a variety of spiritual gifts. Well, naturally, the Corinthians got this all confused, and they got to thinking, well, I must be special if God gave me this particular gift. And some of them were even bragging, well, my gift is better than your gift. And Paul is trying to write, no, he said, that's totally not the point. And he says, you people are so proud of these gifts, these abilities to do things, that you've missed the point. And so in 13, he says, now I will show you the most excellent way. He says, you people are so proud of all these spiritual gifts, you've missed the main point. You've missed the main important thing. These gifts are all temporary. They're going to pass away. They're just here for a particular purpose. But let me teach you the most important way, the most excellent way. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. He says, even if I were able to speak in the language of angels, if I don't have love, it's meaningless. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, he says, even if I knew everything, if I don't have love, it's worthless. And he goes on in that vein. He says, all of these super gifts that you people are so proud of don't mean a thing if you don't have love. Now, the word he uses here is agape. This love is different. Now, when you talk about loving your family and loving your friends and loving ice cream and loving your dog and all of those are based on emotions. It's your feelings, how you feel about something. I love a good book on science fiction. Some of you would probably rather have your eyeballs ripped out than have to read science fiction. That's fine. But the point is, it's based on feeling. But Paul says the most excellent way is not about feeling. And that's what we have to understand. When we're talking about biblical love, it's not about how you feel. Feelings don't enter into this at all. The most excellent way, and I've called it the great love deception, because we have been deceived into believing that love is a feeling. And in our culture, 99 times out of 100, that's what we're talking about. But when the Bible talks about godly love, true love, it's talking about something else. In 1 John, John writes, and he says that, I'm going to give you a new command. But actually, it's an old command. But it's a new command to you because you never got it in the first place. And that's the way a lot of us are. Because we've never really understood the concept of biblical love. Now remember, the first thing to notice, biblical love is a verb. Now he gives several qualities of true love here. Now in English, they're not verbs, but in Greek, they are all verbs. In the original language, this whole passage, every one of these was a verb. So it's not what you feel. What is it? It's what you do. A verb is an action. And so God is not commanding us to feel a certain way toward people. God is saying it's what you do that counts. Over the years, I've had several people come to me for marriage counseling whose marriages are in big trouble. And I've had people say to me, well, I have fallen out of love with my spouse. What do they mean by that? The feeling's gone is what they mean by that. But in actuality, they have quit doing the things of love. And so I shock people, particularly who are having marital issues, when I tell them, I don't care if you feel love or not. And they, what? I said, that's not the issue. You've got to learn to do the things of love. Now, why aren't the feelings the important thing? Feelings change. Good night. I mean, every day when you wake up, you feel differently. Most days, my wife loves me. She feels love. But some days she's so mad at me, she could... I know that's hard to believe. But it's not the feeling. It's the action that God says is what counts. And so Paul gives us the actions of biblical love. When the Bible says God so loved the world, it's not saying God had a kind, wonderful feeling toward us. What's it saying? God does what we need. That's what true love is. Doing what a person needs. And Paul is going to give us a list of things that we do if we love someone. Now, if we do the things of love, usually what will happen with the feelings? They'll follow. Eventually they'll come. Most marriages for centuries, the first time you met your spouse was the day you got married. Or maybe you met them briefly when they made the arrangements for the marriage. And yet those marriages were successful. Why? They had to work at it. They had to learn to do the things of love. They didn't have the feelings to start with, so they had to learn to love each other, to do the things. And that's what Paul is saying here. True biblical love is not how you feel, it's what you do. If you love someone, then he says, you will be patient with them. Now, we covered several of these last week, so we're going to hit them pretty quick and move on. If I love you, I will be patient with you. Now, most of these are words that we use differently than the Bible uses them, so we need to understand what the biblical concept is. Now, when we talk about being patient with someone, usually what we're saying is, we'll put up with you, or we'll wait for you. But the first definition of patience in Scripture is not retaliate. If I love you and you hurt me, I will not hurt you back. We choose not to hurt back. The other day, my wife said to me, "You're not even trainable." Oh, that hurt. That hurt, man. She hurt my feelings. But if I love her, I won't fire back at her. And God says, if we love people and they hurt us, now, do we occasionally hurt each other? Yeah. Unfortunately, as human beings, we're going to occasionally say and do things that hurt people. We may not even mean to do it, but we occasionally do. And God says, if somebody hurts you, choose not to hurt back. What would happen to every fight on the planet if we did this, if everybody did this? You can't have a fight if people don't come back. If somebody does not strike back, you can't have a fight. It takes two. And so God says, if I really love you and you say or do something that hurts me, I will not hurt you back. But what is my nature? Yeah, if somebody breaks my finger, I'm going to break your arm. Not only do we want to hurt back, but we want to hurt back worse than they hurt us. And so, God says true love is patient. It does not hurt back. And then we also talked about it means waiting for God to change the other person. Usually, we want to help them change. Why? Yeah, we want them to be like we want them to be, particularly in marriages. We want to change the other person to conform to our ways. But God says, let me change them. You pray for them. You love them. And you wait for me to change them. And God will do a much better job than we could anyway. Usually when we tell our spouse particularly that we want them to change, how are they going to take that? How do they see that? It's a challenge. Yeah. If I try to change my wife, what am I telling her? I don't like the way you are. I don't accept the way you are. And so that's not usually going to work out real well. Most of us are resistant when somebody wants to change us. So the first quality of biblical love is I don't hurt back. And if we could just practice that one thing, it would revolutionize the world. Then he says love is kind. We saw last week that the word kindness means to be useful in our words, in our deeds. We know what it means to be kind to people. We know when someone has been kind to us. And God says, if I love you, now again, can I love you and not like you? Yes. The Bible does not say you have to like everybody, because that's not possible. Some people are not very likable. But I can still love you. I don't have to like you, but I have to love you. And when you can see a person in need and help them, whether you like them or not. One time I was coming out of a store, and it was 105 degrees. And there was a lady parked next to my car, and I saw that she had a flat tire. Well, I changed her tire. I didn't know her. I didn't like her. Did not like her, but I didn't like her. But I was useful to her. She was an elderly lady. I knew she couldn't change her own tire. She'd have to wait there in 100 degrees while the truck came. So I changed her tire. Well, that was an act of kindness. I'm not going to tell you about the times I wasn't kind, but that was one time I was. So God says, if I love you and I see you need help in some way, I'm going to help you. Now, we know what kind of words are helpful. What kind of words are not helpful? Ma'am? I can't. Insults, harsh, angry, critical. These kind of words are not helpful. The Bible also says, don't say anything to anybody unless it builds them up. And so God says, if I love you, I'm not going to use words that are harsh and angry. Now, why do we do that? Why do we say things that are harsh and mean and critical to people? Ma'am? We're upset? Does that give me the right to be mean? I've asked myself that question a lot of times. Why do I say things to people that I know are not going to be taken well? It just is kind of foolish if you think about it. But that's part of our nature, is we want to hurt people. Love does not envy. We talked about this last time. The word envy comes out of jealousy. It's when you want what the other person has or you don't want them to have it. It's a very ugly thing. It's not real common in marriage, but we have a problem with it as human beings. Love does not boast. Bragging. Why do we brag? Yeah, somehow we think others will think more highly of us if we brag. But in actuality, what happens? Mostly when we brag, other people think badly of us. I can tell you how wonderful I am and how good looking I am and how talented I am. And after a while, you get sick of that. But love does not boast. If I love you, I don't have to tell you how wonderful I am. I don't have to try to impress you. Love is not proud. Pride is probably our second greatest downfall in the area of human relations. When we do have a difficulty with someone, when we have been crossways with someone, if we have been in an argument with someone, or if we hurt them in some way, what would it take most of the time to stop it, to fix it? I'm sorry. You know, most of the time, if we've had a disagreement with somebody, if we would go to them and say, I'm sorry I said that, that would fix it. Why don't we? Pride is sheer pride. Because in our mind, what are we thinking? What's our normal logic when we have hurt somebody else, or they've hurt us, or if we had an argument? What's my logic? Well, at least I'm more right than she was. When she says mean things to me, I said some mean things to her, but she started it. Or she said more mean things to me than I said to her. When was the last time you had an argument with somebody and you felt like you were more wrong than they were? It just doesn't happen. I don't think I've ever had an argument in my life when I felt like I was more wrong than the person I was arguing with. And so pride says, well, they ought to come to me first. If they'll apologize to me, then I'll apologize. But God says, if you love somebody, if you've said anything that's wrong, even if you were only 10% wrong and they were 90% wrong, you take care of the 10%. If you really love them, admit you're wrong. And so pride also does not admit that we're wrong. We don't like to admit that. And then pride demands its rights. We talked about this in depth last week. We all have rights. And where did we get them? We made them up. They are assumed. The only right God ever gave me was the right to accept Him or reject Him. But we demand our rights. Do we have a right to be respected? We would like to think so, but you show me where anybody has ever given you that right. God never did. But we all assume that right. You have to respect me. And so some people get mad and shoot people and kill people because they were disrespected. But that's a right that I kind of assumed. And then last week that we finished on this one, love is not rude. Rudeness basically is offending someone when I know they don't like it. If I say something or do something I know that you find offensive, that's rudeness. If I know that my wife doesn't like for me to leave my socks on the floor, then I shouldn't leave my socks on the floor. No comments. It's bad manners. And God says, if I love people, I'm not going to be rude to them. All right, so today we now come to the next point. This is probably our number one problem in all of relationships. This is our biggest issue. Self-seeking. What's a common word for that? Selfish. Thinking of my needs first. Why is this our biggest problem? We are born with a selfish nature. When you're brought home as a baby from the hospital, who's the only person you care about? Yourself. You don't care if mom has to get up at 2 a.m. to feed you or change you. You don't mind if you wake the whole house up crying. What do you want? You want your needs met. As we grow up, what's the hardest thing to teach your children? Sharing. I'm watching my grandchildren And watching my daughter training them is amazing to me. Just sitting there listening to her, talking to them. And I've heard her say more times, "Don't hit your brother." "Don't push your brother." And they have to be trained. And it takes years to train children to not be selfish. It's hard work because our nature is, let's face it, the whole world is built around me. When you wake up in the morning, what do you think about? Me. What do I need to do? That's partially because we're individuals and we have to feed ourselves and take care of ourselves. But if we're not careful, everything becomes about me. Several years ago, a news article came out that they were going to close the GM plant. Guess what my first thought was? How's that going to affect me? Yeah. If they were to announce tomorrow that they're going to close the airbase, my first thought would be, how's that going to affect my job? How's that going to affect my life? That's our nature. And we have to work against that. And in marriage, particularly, before you're married, who are you worried about? Yourself. You take care of yourself, your needs. Suddenly you get married, and what changes? You have to start thinking about them. And that's not, for 15, 20, 30 years, you've been living by yourself, thinking of yourself, taking care of yourself, and suddenly you've got this other person, and you're supposed to love them and take care of them, and that's hard to do. It's against our nature. But God says, if I love you, I'm going to think of your needs first. And that is the most unnatural thing in the world, because our nature is to think of myself first. Mothers are probably the best example of selflessness on the planet, because a mother instinctively puts her child first. And so it's probably easier for mothers to demonstrate this and practice this than anybody else. But it's still a problem. And selfishness is kind of at the heart of all of our relationship problems. Even in our relationship with God, what do we think? What's God going to do for me? It's hard for me to think about loving God. What can I do for God? Instead of, what can God do for me? That's the issue. Love is not easily angered. Now, the Bible talks about anger several times. It always says that anger is a bad thing, or not always, but generally anger is a bad thing. Why? Because usually when you're angry, you don't make the best choices. Anger usually causes us to say and do things that we really wouldn't choose to do ordinarily. Now, there are two kinds of anger the Bible talks about. There is there's the anger that goes on and on and on and on, causes bitterness and so forth. That's not the word he's using here. The anger he's using here is the quick anger, easily angered. Now, what does he mean when he says, if I love you, I am not easily angered? To understand this, we need to understand, why do we get easily angered? I'm not talking about the downright mad where you want to kill somebody. I'm talking about the quick anger that just pops up and usually gone in a few minutes. Why do we get angry? 99% of the time, why do we get angry? Yeah, and what do I want? My way. And what have we learned, unfortunately? If you get mad, very often people will give in to you. Have you ever seen anybody at the grocery store in line ahead of you get angry at the lady checking out? Why? Why do you get angry at her? She's done nothing wrong. Somehow you're not getting your way. And we have learned, and we learn this as children, when you're playing games, what do you kids do sometimes? What do kids do sometimes? Get mad. I'll take my ball and go home. And we have learned that people will often give in to us if we get angry. And it has become one of the primary ways of getting our way. So, unfortunately, when we grow up to be adults, what do we continue to do? We keep using anger. And a lot of couples get mad at each other 4, 5, 10 times a day because they have learned they can get their way. Do you know what the number one complaint teenagers have about their fathers? They get angry. Why does a father get angry? What's he learned? He has learned that if he gets mad, children will often give in. Why? Fear. You can intimidate a child. A lot of wives are intimidated by their husbands. They get angry, and the husband, if he gets angry enough, the wife will give in just to make peace. And sometimes the other way, the same thing. Unfortunately, we have learned over time, if we get mad, folks will often give in to us. And so you see people in stores, you see people at the DMV, you see people on the street. I mean, why will a person just get furious because they're in line at a light? Or they're stuck in traffic? What do? I guess you've never done this, so you wouldn't know. People honk their horns, they make rude gestures, they yell and scream. Why? You're not going anywhere. You're not going to help anything. Matter of fact, it just makes it worse. But what have we learned over years? That anger helps us get our way sometimes. And so we keep using it. But God says, if you love somebody, you're not going to use anger to get your way. That's what he's talking about here. Love is not easily angered. He's not talking about the long anger. He's talking about that quick stuff that pops up that we use for a reason, and that's to get what we want. And we see people do it every day. If you're not giving me my way, I'll get angry, and then maybe you will. And then every time we do, what happens? It reinforces that bad behavior. That's exactly right. That's why when my kids came along, I did not allow them to throw fits. I mean, if they threw a fit, I'd nip that in the bud because I wasn't going to train them. They could get their way by throwing a fit. It just wasn't allowed. And so I didn't train them to get their way through anger. I just wasn't going to have it. It may be cute when they're 2, but when they're 15, it's not cute anymore. And so he's saying here, don't use anger to get your way. If you love somebody, that's not going to be what you do. This one's another problem for us as humans. Love keeps no record of wrongs. If I love you, now how do you keep a record of wrongs? You remember things. Now the question is, why do we do it? Ammunition, that's exactly right. Have you ever said to your spouse, well, you remember 6 weeks ago when you did this? A lot of parents do this to their children. It's a bad thing. What does it tell a person if you remember something they did earlier? It means you haven't forgiven. Basically, it means, if I remind my wife, well, 3 months ago you said you was going to do this, and or you did this 3 months ago. I am telling someone I have not forgiven. How would we like it if God did us that way? We want God to forgive. We want others to forgive us. But when I keep a record of wrongs, when I keep a record and bring it back up, thinking you did wrong, that's saying I have not forgiven you. And that's a sin in itself, much less it makes it harder to love people. I'm sorry?
Like you're punishing the person.
Yeah. You're punishing him twice for the same crime. It's a failure to forgive. God says that is not acceptable. God makes it plain. He says, I'm not even going to forgive you if you don't forgive others. And if somebody you really care about, particularly a spouse or a child or a friend, keeps doing this to you, what do you think? If somebody keeps bringing up your past mistakes, after a while, what do you think? Yeah, for one thing, I can't ever do anything right. What else? Well, eventually, what point do you get to? And you say, why bother? If they're never going to get over it, why bother? If they're just going to keep bringing this thing up over and over and over. I've had couples come into my office over the years, and I had one couple came in, I remember vividly. This woman was blaming her husband for something that had happened 10 years earlier. It wasn't even his fault, but she was still blaming him. She even admitted it wasn't his fault, but she still kept bringing it up after 10 years. What does that tell that poor man? I can't win. What's the point? And so God says, if I love you, I don't keep bringing up your past failures. Parents sometimes do this to children, and it's a bad thing. They need to understand, it's gone, it's done with, it's forgiven. We're not bringing it up again. I certainly don't want God continually bringing up all my failures. Couples that I've counseled who are going to get married, I always teach them what I call the garbage rule. And I've had several of them come back to me after years later and says, of all the stuff you taught us, that was the best. How long can you keep garbage around the house? About 3 days. After 3 days, what happens? It smells bad. You don't want to keep it more than 3 days. So you throw it out. If someone has done something, made a mistake, failed, done something wrong, how long do you need to remember it? Maybe 3 days. It might need to be dealt with. But eventually, what do you do with it? You throw it out. And after you throw it out, then what? It's gone. You can't bring it back. Once you throw your garbage out in the can and the truck picks it up and takes it to the dump, it's gone. You can't go find it. And we need to learn to get over things. When somebody has hurt us, done something to offend us, we have to get over it. If you don't, what happens to you? Not to mention the relationship problem, but just to you, what happens? Yeah, you start getting bitter. And bitterness is a poison. We're not designed to hold it. And so God says, if I love you, I'm not going to keep a record of your wrongs. But we do it. Why? We want to keep it just, if we have another fight, then we can go back here and we've got this big box that we put all these hurts in, and we dig around and find, see where you did this? And God says, that's not right. That's not love. Love says, I'm not going to keep a record of your mistakes. Yes, you did something stupid and wrong and foolish and dumb, but we're going to let it go. I'm throwing it out. I'm not going to bring it up anymore. There's not a one of us in here that hasn't done things that we're glad they're gone. We don't need them brought up over and over and over. And if we love somebody, God says you don't do that. You just let it go. You throw it away. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Now, what in the world does it mean for a Christian to delight in evil? Now, remember, we're talking about relationships here. If I love you, I don't delight in evil. Now, why would a Christian ever delight in evil anyway? That doesn't make sense. What's he talking about here? This is a special situation. How do you delight in evil in a relationship? Well, that would be covered under patience. But in this case, what do you think he's talking about? Delighting in evil. He's not even saying that if that person does something terrible, that's good. What's he saying? What's the most common way that we delight in evil? Okay, that's one way. Yeah. Ma'am? If someone we don't like gets what's coming to them. Yeah. Yeah, that's one way of delighting in evil. Yeah, he finally got what's coming to him. Yeah. The most common way we delight in evil, and we got to be careful because all of us probably have been guilty of this, is gossip. What is gossip? Yeah, if I share something bad about you with somebody else that doesn't need to know about it, that's gossip. And that's delighting in evil. Hey, did you hear that Jeff got arrested the other night for drunk driving? Why did I tell you that? Because I was delighting in evil. Yeah. You know, sometimes we need to talk to people about problems. But if you talk to someone about a problem and they're not part of the solution or the problem itself, that's gossip. I don't need to tell that. That's delighting in evil. Now, if we love somebody, God says, you don't do that. If your kid brought home straight D's and F's, would you get on the phone and call all your friends and say, hey, let me tell you how stupid my kid is? No, you wouldn't. Why? Because you love your kids and you don't want everybody to think they're dumb. You don't want to tell about terrible things your children have done. Now, if they bring home straight A's, fine. Call up all the neighbors and say, hey, my kid brought home straight A's for the first time. That's great. But when bad things happen, God says, don't go spreading that everywhere. That's delighting in evil. And also, if something bad happens to someone I don't like, and I say, oh, goody, they got what's coming to them. That's also delighting in evil. And then he finishes up by saying, love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. What's he saying? Love always chooses to do what's right, what's good. And love doesn't give up. You know, sometimes people make so many mistakes, we say, okay, that's it. I've had enough of them. But God says, if I love you, I don't give up on you. And one other main point, it's unconditional. What does that mean? That's right. You don't have to earn it. This is a big mistake sometimes husbands and wives make and parents make. We make the other person earn our love. Why do we do that? We tell them, if you'll do what I want you to do, I'll love you. That's a very common problem with parents and children. A lot of children don't feel like their parents love them because they don't act the way they should sometimes, and the parent acts like they don't love them. It's a terrible thing to do, and they don't mean it, but it happens. Why do we make people earn our love? So they'll do what we want. Yeah. And so God says, if I love you, I'm going to love you whether you deserve it or not. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to behave the way I want you to. That's the problem. People have to behave the way I want them to, or I'm not going to love them. All right, our time's up. Thank you for being here today.